Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at First Chronicles chapter 10, where we read about the death of King Saul. In First Chronicles, notice we've already covered the genealogies, chapters 1 through 9. After chapter 10, we're going to see the reign of King David, but right now we're in chapter 10, the death of Saul, and of course, is part of the histories of Israel's first two kings, but it's not giving all the history of Saul, only his death. That's where we're picking up. First Chronicles chapter 10 and verse 1. Now the Philistines fought against Israel, and the men of Israel fled before the Philistines and fell slain on Mount Gilboa. Now, when we speak about the Philistines, remember that the Philistines were located in the southwest section of Canaan, right along the seacoast. They had settled there over the years. They had five major cities in that area, very distinctive in their culture. They seem to have come, most scholars think today, they came from somewhere in the Aegean, maybe related slightly to the Mycenaeans, another people group that are there in the Aegean. Um, the Philistines were technologically advanced when compared to the Israelites. The Philistines had the secret of how to smelt and develop iron. The Israelites did not know how to do that. They were relatively backward. In fact, if an Israelite wanted his farm implement sharpened, he would have to take it down to the Philistines. They would take it into a back room and they'd work with the iron and do that. And they weren't letting the Israelites in on that secret, at least not up to this point in history. And so the Philistines fought, and here on Mount Gilboa, you're looking at Mount Gilboa, looking at it from the east, looking toward the west. It's here that Saul and the other Israelites lost to the Philistines, and it's going to be here that Saul dies. Verse 2, the Philistines closely pursued Saul and his sons, and the Philistines struck down Jonathan, Abinadab, and Malchi-Shua, the sons of Saul. The battle became heavy against Saul, and the archers overtook him, and he was wounded by the archers. Verse 4, then Saul said to his armor bearer, draw your sword and thrust me through with it, otherwise these uncircumcised will come and abuse me. That probably would have been the case, but his armor bearer would not, for he was greatly afraid, and therefore Saul took his own sword and fell on it. Remember how at the end of, or at the beginning of 2 Samuel, we have an Amalekite who comes and says, he gives a different story. I suspect he might have been embellishing, he might have been lying, because here we're told exactly what took place. We get down to verse 7. When all the men of Israel who were in the valley saw that they had fled and that Saul and his sons were dead, they forsook their cities and fled, and the Philistines came and lived in them. And the place where they're coming to live, I imagine part of it is going to be here in this valley of Jezreel. The Mount of Gilboa juts out into that valley. But also there along the Shephelah, you see the Philistines living along the coast. The foothills are sort of a disputed territory, and then up in the mountains, the Israelites lived in the mountains. Verse 8, it came about the next day when the Philistines came to strip the slain that they found Saul, his dead body, and his sons fallen on Mount Gilboa. So they stripped him and took his head and his armor and sent messengers around the land of the Philistines to carry the good news to their idols and to the people. Notice how the Philistines see this as a victory, not just a military victory, but a religious victory, a spiritual victory. Verse 10, they put his armor in the house of their gods and fastened his head in the house of Dagon, which is one of their pagan gods. Verse 11, when all Jabesh Gilead heard all that the Philistines had done to Saul, all the valiant men arose and took away the body of Saul and the bodies of his sons and brought them to Jabesh. Now, Jabesh Gilead is on the east side of the Jordan River, and they buried their bones under the oak in Jabesh and fasted 7 days. Here's Jabesh Gilead on a map. And Mount Gilboa, notice, on the west side of the Jordan. Jabesh Gilead is on the east side of the Jordan River. And Saul, who was himself from Gibeah in the south, in the country belonging to Benjamin, you remember at the very beginning of his kingship that there had been that instance when the Ammonites had invaded Jabesh Gilead, had threatened to take their city, and not only to capture their city, in fact, the men of Jabesh Gilead were ready to surrender. But the king of Ammon said, "You can surrender, but my sign of victory is that I'm going to gouge out the right eye of every man." And the men of Jabesh Gilead had sent word to Saul saying, "Help! Somebody come and help us." And Saul had been out on his farm that day. He was sort of a farmer king. And he took a yoke of oxen, the ones he'd been using, and cut them in pieces and sent them throughout the territory of Israel by the hand of messengers, saying, "Whoever does not come out after Saul and after Samuel, so shall it be done to his oxen." The Israelites heard that message. They got the pieces of animals sent to them, and they all responded, and they rescued Jabesh Gilead. So here now, many years later, Jabesh Gilead, in thankfulness for how Saul had delivered them, they can't deliver Saul, but they go and they rescue his body and they give his body a decent burial. Verse 13, so Saul died for his trespass, which he committed against the Lord, because of the word of the Lord, which he did not keep, and also because he asked counsel of a medium, making inquiry of it. Remember that had taken place at the end of 1 Samuel, and did not inquire of the Lord. Therefore, he, that is God, killed him and turned the kingdom to David, the son of Jesse. So this is really just that's a concluding story, but really it's the beginning story for the coming of David. And so we have the death of Saul, which kicks off. Now we're going to move now to the reign of David in the rest of First Chronicles. When we get to Second Chronicles, it'll go from Solomon, the son of David, all the way to the exile to Babylon and the return right after that.